Good evening. Lovely to see you. Welcome to all of you who are in the room and also to our people who are online. Let me just say a few words as an introduction. This is a hybrid event. It's a specific panel which we have, which has been hosted by the Department of Management. We've had a whole week of discussions on the theme of digital identity. So this panel will be on the same theme, and it has a specific purpose, which is to recap on the 20 years since the launching of the LSE Identity Project. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Who am I? I'm Shireen Madden, and I'm here at the LSE, working at the LSE in the Department of International Development and also in the Information Systems and Innovation Group in the Department of Management. And I have a keen interest in digital identity in the development and humanitarian sectors. So let me then introduce our panelists. First of all, we've got Professor Edgar Whitley, and he's going to give us a short talk, a short lecture on the Digital Identity Project. Edgar is co-coordinator of the LSE Identity Project. He's a professor in information systems here in the Department of Management at the LSE. And apart from his very influential role in this project that we're going to talk about, he's also advised governments on the theme of digital identity around the world in many different countries. He's also been influential in stirring media debates and being in the public limelight in the aftermath of the launching of the UK government's Digital Identity Project. Let me also introduce the other panelists, and in the order in which I have made my notes. We have Dr. Gus Hossain, who is Executive Director of Privacy International and has also been involved in the LSE Identity Project, active in the area of technology and human rights at global, regional, and national levels, both from an academic and an activism perspective. Professor Ritika Kera, professor at the prestigious IIT Delhi, Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi. Ritika is a development economist focusing on social policy issues in India. And in her recent book, 2019, Dissent on Aadhaar, which we will hear about later on, the digital identity platform in India, she discusses the risks that digital identity systems bring, drawing on her extensive fieldwork in the country. And last but not least, we have Dr. Silvia Maciero, Associate Professor of Information Systems at the University of Oslo. And Silvia is a prominent and very prolific scholar in the field of ICT for development. She herself has done extensive fieldwork on this topic of digital identity, even before the Aadhaar system in India was implemented. And her recent book, Unfair ID, really does expose some of the hidden complexities and risks of digital ID. So we are going to start with Professor Edgar Whitley, who is, as I say, co-coordinator of the LSE Identity Project. And he is going to give us a looking back.
Very rapid history.
Looking back.
So thank you very much, Shireen. I've got 25 minutes to go through 20 years of history. This is the report that caused all of this stuff. We can drop it on the table. You can hear that this was a substantial piece of academic research. For those who were in the room, you were listening to a playlist of some of the #1 songs from 2005. Some of you may not even have been born then, but that was just to give you a sense of what was happening 20 years ago when this research work was first launched. In fact, the story starts a little bit earlier. In November 2004, we had a Labour government, again, at that time, Prime Minister Tony Blair. They introduced a bill published a bill to introduce national identity cards for the UK. And in January 2025, work began on the LSE Identity Project. We were aware of these proposals, and we just had questions as academics about what was being proposed, what the impact of what was being proposed. We wanted to get a range of stakeholder perspectives on what was involved, what was likely to happen. We were interested in the technical architecture that the government was proposing and how they were going to do that. We were interested in understanding the legislation and what the implications of that might mean. And as I say, the plan was to publish a detailed report on the government's issues and make recommendations as to how these potential things, how we might improve what the government was trying to do. Because the question is not, there's sort of a question of whether, but mostly the big question is how. If you're going to give identification to people, how do you go about it? What's the best way to go about it? As part of that process, we did an expert panel consultation with organizations from business, industry, academia. That gave us lots of really interesting insights and made us question and aware of different perspectives on many of the assumptions that were underlying the government's reports. On the 21st of March 2005, we introduced an interim draft report on the ID card because the bill was being debated in the House of Lords at that time. Then, if you were around, in May 2005, there was a general election that was won again by the Labour government, their third consecutive victory. And in their manifesto, they made a commitment, and the wording is really important for a little bit later on, to introduce ID cards, including biometric data like fingerprints, backed up by a national register and rolling out initially on a voluntary basis as people renew their passports. So this was what the government was planning to do. The new bill, which was essentially the same version as the old bill, was introduced to the new government because you have, it's a new parliament, so that things have to be done. And at that time, both the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats were very strongly opposed to the idea of identity cards, the idea of the bill. And interestingly, in 2004, for the earlier version of the identity cards bill, we'd organized an event here at LSE where there was this backbench MP who had basically been forced to sit on the bill committee because they needed a Conservative member of that committee. We had a recording of that meeting. David Cameron, then the Conservative leader of the Conservative Party, talked about his experiences. He says, I sit on the Home Affairs Select Committee that's reviewing the legislation. When you sit on the Select Committee, you're meant to leave your prejudices and your party affiliation at the door and approach the subject with an open mind. You are just reviewing the legislation. But I have to say that I find it extremely difficult. I've always been a skeptic about ID cards, and everything I've heard so far has further convinced me that that's the right way to be skeptical about ID cards. I think the first is, if you start with philosophical concerns, that ID cards change the relationship between the citizen and the state, that instead of the state being the servant to the citizen, it suddenly becomes the master. You have to do things because the state says, rather than the other way around. From the evidence that we've had on the committee so far from those in favor of ID cards, it seems the argument keeps changing. And again, this is going to be something interesting to come back to. Now they start off with the terrorism argument. And when you ask about why ID cards will make a difference on terrorism, they'll shift slightly to an immigration argument. So there's this view that ID cards are supposed to be the solution to lots of things, but never could be very precise about what was involved. So the scheme was based around having a national identity register, a centralized government database. They were going to use biometrics, so images of your face, of your fingerprints, and also potentially of your iris, to make sure that you were not in the database more than once, because if you've got two ID cards, you can get lots of things. They would be verifying your identity in lots of places. It will all be done online. There would be a record of all of those verifications. It would be used by the private sector, but paid for by the public purse, because this was a great thing for the British society. It was going to prevent identity theft or identity fraud. It would prevent terrorism. It would be designed in accordance with the international obligations around passports and the idea that we must have biometric passports. It would be designed by the Home Office, not a citizen-facing department, the Home Office, and it will be there to enable e-government, access to government services, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what led to the production of our report. We launched that on the 27th of June, 2005, so just under 20 years ago. And we evaluated what these proposals were going to do in terms of national security, organized crime, policing, race, discrimination, immigration, identity fraud, etc. We also spoke with biometrics experts and said, is this idea of using fingerprints to check on people definitely the right way forward? We looked at security issues, etc. We also raised questions about public trust. Do you trust the government to run a database with lots of details about individual citizens? And for those who are knowledgeable about the UK IT sector, is the government the best one to build a large-scale IT project? And although we're academics critiquing, we also provided an alternative blueprint to say, these are the concerns, here are different ways of responding to those kinds of concerns. One particular concern that really got a lot of traction was the question of how much this scheme was going to cost. The government was very clear it was going to cost 5.86 billion over 10 years. Exactly 5.86 billion. We said, well, first question was we evaluated the costs in slightly different ways, but we also said, well, if everything goes well, we think it's probably going to cost at least 10 billion. And if there are all sorts of problems, project overruns, lack of buy-in, et cetera, it could cost close to 20 billion. So between 2 times and 4 times what was proposed by the government's official figures. And they'd included optimism bias in their figures, et cetera, et cetera. Our analysis, shall we say, was not popular, is the polite way to put it. The Prime Minister, Tony Blair, said some of the figures bandied around about costs are absolutely absurd. It's 5.86 billion pounds over 10 years, no matter what's going to happen. Mr. Clark, I'm going to have to show you all of the Home Secretaries, the ministers responsible for this, because there were quite a few over that time. The Home Office Minister at the time, Charles Clark, said our report was technically incompetent. So you're here for a public event about technically incompetent research. The figures that we had were simply mad. I think that's a technical description. And he accused the LSE of running a campaign against ID cards. Nevertheless, the debate developed over time. There was a lot of discussion about the role of costs. And in March 2006, the ID cards bill became an ID cards act. It was actually, the legislation was received. The scheme was basically unchanged despite all of this parliamentary debate from what had been proposed in an early version in 2002. A key consideration was that every 6 months they had to report on how much it was likely to cost based on what they'd been doing over the last 6 months. And that was a fantastic way of keeping the LSE involved in the discussions, because every 6 months the government would issue a report saying this is how much we now think it's going to be, and journalists would then go along and say, who do we know that has a more critical view about those figures? Oh, it was those LSE people. So every 6 months we would have a story explaining what was going on and how much it was going to cost. The government also created a new agency, the UK Identity and Passport Service, 1st of April Fool's Day, not a great date that I wouldn't necessarily have done. James Hall, who was ex-Accenture, appointed the chief executive in October 2006. In July 2006, somebody got hold of some leaked emails between different members of the project team. Extracts also, if everything went perfectly, which it will not, it is very debatable, given the performance of government IT projects, whether the National Identity Register turns out to be, whether whatever it turns out to be, and that is a worry in itself, we don't actually know what we're trying to build, can be procured, delivered, tested, and rolled out in just over 2 years, and whether the resources exist within government and industry to run 2 overlapping procurements. What benchmark in the Home Office do we have that suggests that this is even remotely feasible? I conclude that we are setting ourselves up to fail. So even within government, there were concerns about the viability of this project. End of 2006, the last day of Parliament in December 2006, the new Home Secretary issued a strategic action plan where they essentially proposed a radical redesign to address the most common criticisms that the project is high risk and very expensive. And a wonderful turn of phrase, doing something sensible is not necessarily a U-turn, something that perhaps the current government might want to bear in mind as it thinks about changing its policies. Just a reminder, the different Home Secretaries, Charles Clarke, John Reid, Jackie Smith, and Alan Johnson, all of whom were the ministers in charge from 2005 to 2010 of the ID scheme, along with lots of other responsibilities on that. 2010, after 5 years, we're due another general election. So Gus and I had to look at all of the manifestos of all of the political parties about what they thought they were going to do with ID cards if they were elected. Everybody, apart from the Labour Party and technically the monster raving loony party, said that they were going to scrap ID cards. Labour Party, because that was their official policy. Monster raving loony party, because the plastic card is quite good for scraping ice off your windscreen on a cold winter's morning. That literally was their manifesto policy. 2010, Labour doesn't win. We then get a coalition government, the Lib Dems, who've always been opposed to ID cards, the Conservatives, who are also opposed to ID cards. We heard David Cameron's talking about it, but also ideologically, this is about the citizen relationship with the state. They create the coalition agreement. I can imagine the Section 3 civil liberties, we will scrap the ID card scheme, the National Identity Register, contact point database, and halt the generation of biometric passports. That was probably quite easy to agree. How we're going to deal with student finances may have had a bit longer conversation. They became the government, the coalition government. The first bill of the new government was to get rid of ID cards. And because all of this data was on computer disks, nobody could really be sure that they would definitely be destroyed. So we have Damien Green, the Home Office Minister, literally throwing hard disks, which had all of these citizens' data, into an industrial crusher, because once it is dust, there's not much more that you can do to try and retrieve all of this data. And a number of us 15 years ago got together after the bill was introduced and ID cards were actually destroyed. You can see whether we've changed at all over those years. Gus and I wrote a book reflecting on our experiences, questions around digital identities, government policies, etc. We also had an impact case study where we talked about how this was done. The former Home Secretary before this report, David Blunkett, said the main report of LSE's Identity Project changed the culture and atmosphere around and attitudes towards the scheme and its intention. That was pretty good evidence that possibly the research work that LSE had done had a little bit of an impact on policy. Before 2010, when Gordon Brown was looking to take over as Prime Minister, he got Sir James Crosby to write a report onto, can we get ourselves out of this hole that we've built around ID cards? And Sir James came up with a very nice way of changing what we even understand by these ID systems. He made a distinction between ID management, identity management, which suggests data sharing and database consolidation primarily serves the interests of the database owners, i.e. the government or banks or whatever. His alternative was what he called ID assurance. The terms don't matter, but it's just a different perspective. He sees this as a consumer-led concept, a process that meets an important consumer need without necessarily providing any spin-off benefits to the owners of the database. So this is something where you are helping the citizen, but not necessarily giving benefits and implications to the government, because this is about getting society to operate in a much better way. The problem of how you prove who you are to government still remains, and the government started developing Verify, which was a system that was explicitly designed to not do what the ID card scheme. It was not going to be a centralized database, and it was not going to be run by the government. It was going to be federated, run by private sector companies, because they are, by definition, not the government. We were involved in a privacy and consumer advisory group, and we came up with a set of identity assurance principles to guide how Verify would operate. When we were developing them, we presented them very much in the first person, because this is how an identity scheme that benefits the individual operates. So I can exercise control. It takes place in ways that I can understand. I can use multiple different identifiers. So one of the big technical questions around many ID systems is, do you have one number that is stuck with you throughout your life? Or is it possible that you could have multiple numbers and let the other side of the transaction work out whether they have got records for you, minimize the amount of data? If your data is out of date, let's not fine you £1,000 for not telling some government department that you've moved. Let's instead say maybe the transaction won't work, and then you remember that you need to tell somebody that you've moved at that point. Service access, you can copy your data. This was pre-GDPR, but we're anticipating what GDPR did. If we're going to use private companies, then those companies should be using agreed standards and should be accredited, so that if they don't follow those standards, we can kick them out of the system. If there are issues, if there are disputes, we know where to go to get help. And one that we really liked was, let's not rely on ancient laws to try and justify slightly dubious practices. If you want to do something additional with your ID, then let's have a proper debate in Parliament to do that. So that gets us to kind of about 2015. And I just want to reflect on what we've been calling the social study of ID. We see, particularly from an information systems academic perspective, that these identity systems are very much a socio-technical phenomenon. They're not just the design of the technical system, and they're not just a sociological problem. There are societal issues, technological considerations, policy drivers. So, for example, a societal issue is what happens with all those people who can't get an ID. 2005, we wrote and said, we want to limit the risk of exclusion. 2010 should explicitly address identity exclusion. World Economic Forum, be inclusive. Mike McKinsey, if you have risks if you exclude people from your identity systems. The World Bank, first two principles. Let's make sure that our ID systems are as inclusive as possible, because otherwise we're going to have real problems. And I'm presenting a report tomorrow on the economic impact of ID exclusion, so this is still an ongoing topical issue. There are also technical architecture questions. The idea of having a centralized database in 2025 is, at least, shall we say, much more contested. But this is what the Home Office told us when we had our proposal for saying maybe this centralized database is not such a good idea. The government proposes a centralized approach. There is one central register. User organizations can verify a limited set of facts against the register to authenticate a person's identity and help them retrieve and manage records held in their own system. So there's a single place where you go to do that. This approach is common sense. For example, a bank or supermarket does not leave small amounts of cash in its tills overnight. It transfers the cash to a safe, a highly secure central environment. This is much more cost-effective than making every individual till as secure as the safe. Our approach complies with industry best practice. Well, some people in industry that were selling you the services as being much more effective. A centralized based model is recognized by leading IT, security, etc., to be the best way to handle lots of data. 2025, we are much more decentralized. We've got many more alternatives. Mandatory systems. Is an ID system mandatory for everybody? Remember the Labour manifesto. We will introduce them initially on a voluntary basis as people renew their passports. What does that mean? When you renew your passport every 10 years, does that mean you automatically get an ID card? Or does that mean when you renew your passport, you can possibly get an ID card if you want? The Labour government said, no, the manifesto says when you renew your passport, you will get an ID card. Because you don't have to have a passport. You don't have to go on holiday abroad. That was their reading. Members of the House of Lords particularly pushed back on this. Any normal person reading the manifesto commitment would interpret it as when I can choose whether to go on the register to have an ID card when I renew my passport. And if I don't want to, I would choose not to. That is what voluntary would initially mean to anybody who read it, and the legislation ping-ponged between the different houses of parliament. We also had a lot of fun cartoons where people were critical of the ID. This is basically a government minister not being able to show their ID card because they'd forgotten it, because it was... the idea of having a database of everybody's fingerprints, which you use to make sure you're not issued with more than one fingerprint twice. Suddenly, according to this was the police going, oh, we've discovered that your fingerprints were involved in a major criminal heist from 20 years earlier, because we've now matched those fingerprint sites. And everyone kind of laughs, and somebody pointed out that that's not a mobile fingerprint reader, et cetera, et cetera. But then in 2024, you get the government saying, well, we'll do face recognition against, for example, the passport database, which has got images of everybody's faces. So if we've spotted that you were in the street having done a crime, we can just run it against those kinds of things. Just coming up on time, let's bring us back to 2025. I want to talk about two particular issues that are particularly relevant and particularly timely. The first one is about academic freedom, and we were incredibly lucky to have the support of our institution, of Howard Davis as the LSE director, because essentially, so that's Charles Clarke. The other one looks a bit like Peter Mandelson, definitely doesn't look like anybody who's involved in the ID card report, but essentially the government, having said that our research was completely mad, essentially tried to cut down the research. They said, can you just get them to go away, perhaps until after this legislation has passed or later? But the director, the president of LSE, wrote to the Times, over the last 6 months, a team of LSE researchers has mounted a major research project to assess the bill. It's 60 people contributed to the report, overseen by a committee of a dozen LSE professors. The report is long, 305 pages, and detailed. One conclusion amongst many is that the government scheme will be much more costly than it claims. Aware of the work, Home Office officials demanded to see advance copies. Before they had been provided, the Home Secretary condemned the cost estimates as mad. When it was published, he described the analysis as a fabrication, and one of the project managers as highly motivated. Following the media coverage, because of the launch of the report, LSE's Governing Council reasserted the right of academic researchers to publish and be damned. The report is not, of course, a corporate LSE document. LSE does not do research. Researchers at LSE does. It does, however, represent the honest and considered views of a team of experts. Later that year, or I think early in 2006, the Prime Minister again repeated his assertion that the report was written by one person who was politically motivated. And this is a beautiful English civil servant kind of conversation. At Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday, the leader of the opposition asked you about the so-called LSE report on the blah, blah, blah. In response, you said that the report was written by someone who is a campaigner against ID cards on civil liberty grounds. That is not the case. A similar point has been made before by Home Office ministers, and I wrote to clarify the position. I am sorry that that clarification has not been passed to your office. Thank you, Howard. That was very, very much appreciated. There's also this question of what exactly is your ID system trying to do? And Gus and I wrote a short paper on how do we always get these kinds of policies so wrong? Are identity policies capable of addressing a diverse range of policy goals? And what might we do if we want to actually be helpful? So how can we design an ID system that tries to address these things? Can we do an ID system that addresses multiple goals? And with perfect timing, you may have seen the coverage in the UK last week of a report from Labour Together about a proposal for a Brit card, a way of a digital identity credential that can tackle illegal migration. And how is that going to happen? Well, first thing, it's going to be mandatory for everybody. Everybody who has a right to work and a right to live in the country will be issued with an ID credential, even though the latest government figures suggest, or government-sponsored research suggests that nearly 6 million people in the UK are ID challenged. So they will struggle to get this thing that they are mandatory required to have. And as well as checking, confirming, yep, I have a right to work, I have a right to rent a property, we will also share that data with the Home Office so that they can have a complete centralized database of everybody's right to work check or everybody's right to rent check. But by the way, this is going to be privacy friendly, so don't worry anything about it. So if you think about what the policy is, if you have this concern that illegal migrants in this country are being offered employment, do you think that those employers are suddenly going to change their behaviors because they have a smart app and a digital, easy-to-use verification process? We say it's open to question. I have my own particular views on that. Polly Toynbee, writing in The Guardian, says that this will be great because it will help Labour address reform, because reform in the UK have this particular concern about managing migration. Andrew Orlowski in the Daily Telegraph suggests that digital ID cards could be Starmer's poll tax. And if you go back to the 1990s, when the Conservative government tried to introduce the poll tax, lots of people essentially disappeared from voter registration lists, because if you were on the voter registration list, you would then be charged the poll tax. He also points out that there are some big security problems with the way in which these proposals are going to be done. I've overrun my time, but I just want to say thank you to a number of people. Thank you to Vivian. Thank you to Ian Angel and Patrick Dunleavy, who were the kind of lead professors kind of taking a lot of the flak. Thank you to all of the co-authors who were involved in that report 20 years ago, many of whom were named in the report, some of whom decided that their industrial connections meant that they couldn't be named. And a particular thanks also to Howard, who provided that top-level support for academic research that is so important, particularly in 2025. Thank you.
Thanks, Edgar. So we are now going to have some questions, and I'm going to ask an opening question to our panelists based on this extremely detailed description of the emergence and the evolution of the entire LSE Identity Project. And I just want to ask the three panelists how, through your own research on the broad theme of digital ID, how do you connect with some of these social aspects that we've been talking about, social, political? Sylvia?
So get the honor. Okay, so big thanks. I want to say big thanks, Edgar, for inviting us, and for, I must say, some happy celebration, 20 years of the LSE Identity Project. So very briefly, sharing on how my work connects to this topic. I will start from something that Edgar said about socio-technical considerations on digital identity systems. I work at the University of Oslo, but for 7 years I've had the pleasure to work here, not so long after this report was released. And that's where I started studying digital identity in the Indian food security system through one, actually the largest digital identity project worldwide. Is called Aadhaar. Ritika will say more, I believe, about this topic. And it is to this day what I study, the largest biometric identity project existing. And it is a biometric project that mediates social welfare schemes. So very much this idea of accessing social welfare through this, through the very presence of a biometric infrastructure. What really echoes what Edgar says is, I don't believe we can approach digital identity without a socio-technical angle. I come from the information systems discipline, like you, Edgar and Shirin. So very much this idea of seeing the technology through the eyes of its social mediation. In my research, this social mediation happens at the moment, I like using the word interface. So at the moment at which the person, in the case of the Indian food security system, through biometric infrastructures that are very much at the moment, it's called a ration shop. It's the shop in which the person accesses rice, wheat, sugar, kerosene. So I approach digital identity very much through the encounter of the person with the technology and interrogating the whole idea of like social welfare through biometric infrastructures. There's more to say, but there's much more that we can decide. So this is my approach to the topic. Thank you.
Ritika, and then Gus. Yeah.
So, just by way of context, for those who don't know, I was working on welfare programs in India, the delivery, trying to improve delivery and to reduce, what could the government do to reduce corruption? And at that time, the Indian government around 2010 decided to bring this major digital identity, so-called digital identity project to the country. And it was being brought under the garb of improving welfare delivery in the country. And I didn't particularly have any interest in information systems or ID systems, but the fact is that they were going to link it with the programs that we were interested in. And there were very few, importantly, there were very few critical voices in India against the project at that time. There were most of the media, including very sensible and critical columnists, were writing in favor of it. And so I started poking around and I stumbled upon the identity report online. And for me, it was like hitting a gold mine because the trajectory, I think, of the identity project here matches or follows the Indian trajectory follows what happened here, but it begins to diverge when there's a change in government. So again, in the Indian context, it was also brought by the less conservative party in the name of improving welfare, et cetera, et cetera. They were not able to decide what is the purpose of, it was against black money, it was against terrorism, it was for welfare delivery and so on and so forth. They wanted to cut out middlemen. And so we were encountering exactly the same problems. And I thought, oh my God, this cannot be true that, it was like a copycat situation. So in the end, actually, it became a very important tool for me to understand, to zoom out a little bit, but also to see how academics could intervene in the debate, and also to see that it's okay to take a position and that it wasn't always necessary to be an academic who says on the one hand and on the other hand, which is a really frustrating thing in these kinds of contexts. So that was my introduction to the report, and I have to say, even today, it's a very valuable resource.
Thank you. Gus.
What I can say about what was hard at the time is that you want to be able to provide information for public discourse about complicated technological systems. And scholarship at the time wasn't particularly good at that. The scholarship was quite broken up in that there was a lot of scholarship on some of the drivers that might have been behind this, like, will it help with terrorism? Will it help with identity fraud? Some good academic analyses might have existed around definitions of terrorism, responses to terrorism, but not really around ID and terrorism because there was no ID literature at that time. There was some literature about the what, like the technology, what is the biometrics, But they were very scientific in nature. But we needed to be versant in that. So we became versant in that. And that was helpful. But as you saw, the ministers just kept on rebutting it by saying we were technically incompetent. Where the real opportunity for us was at the time, and I hope that's still the case for academia, is we can explore the how. How does this get manifested in society? How does it get used? What does it look like for its use at a technical layer, an economic layer, a social layer? And I think ultimately that's what made the report have such currency, because we could question not just what's in the law, but we could say, we imagine if it lives up to this purpose, it has to look like that. If it lives up to this purpose, it also has to look like this. And it becomes this beast, which we then captured in the articulation of a cost. And that's what the media loved. And so that was the challenge that I hope academia is able to respond more quickly to analysis of complex socio-technical systems in a way that can inform existing policy discourse. I just haven't seen it as recently.
Great, thank you. So a lot has changed. 20 years, we are talking about global economy, the geopolitics, everything that's going, and of course, advances in technology. So my next question is about decentralized web. We have a lot of new technologies, Web 3.0, as it's called, verifiable credentials. They do promise to reshape at least the way in which we as individuals manage our own data, personal data, including our digital identities as well. So the question is, to what extent do we think that this will shift greater control to individuals? I will leave this open.
So I think one of the really interesting questions comes back to that differentiation that Sir James Crosby put. Is your issue trying to solve a social problem potentially for the individual, or do you sort of want to keep an eye on things because that's what you think the state should do? So a classic one is proof of age for buying alcohol, because we kind of do, alcohol's got stronger and there's a different drinking kind of culture. So perhaps we agree that people under 18 should not be drinking alcohol. But then the question is, do you just want to be confident that the people that you are serving are over 18? Or do you actually want to have a record that you could then show to the local authority or whoever that we serve these 20 people and we confirm that they were all over 18? And it kind of becomes a policy question as to, do you just want to have confidence that the people that you are serving are over 18? And the latest technological, well, I was going to say latest, but they've been around for 20 or 30 years, zero knowledge proofs. You can prove computationally that somebody is over 18 without disclosing any data, without having any audit trail, and therefore satisfy that part of the process that you actually want to do. But if you kind of go, well, we don't quite trust that, so we should have a record, we should have an audit trail, you come back to what the system is doing. So I think some of this is about just pushing the question of what is the problem that you are actually trying to solve, and are you prepared to be a little bit more innovative, a little bit more 2025, and just go, we can solve that problem without doing all of these other I would say unnecessary, but certainly privacy invading kinds of activity. If you want to check that somebody has a right to rent, you can have a check that someone has a right to rent, a credential that you've got on your smartphone. If you can give that to everybody, kind of makes sense. But then letting the Home Office have a record of all of those transactions adds another policy thing that's not necessarily what people initially thought that they wanted to do when they wanted to check that only the right people could have rental properties.
So it's a case of doing this for efficiency for the long term. Anyone else would like to respond to that? Yeah, Ritika?
So I think there was this quote about the digital ID turning the tables on government as servant and government as master. I think what's happening right now is an inversion of technology as servant and technology as master. A lot of aspects of our lives are getting digitized, and that digitized data is clearly of value to certainly to the private sector. And I feel that by not defining the problem statement clearly is a way of obfuscating the purpose, which is actually to facilitate data mining of various sorts. So if the purpose is to improve welfare delivery, in the Indian case, for instance, then the solutions lie elsewhere. And some of those solutions require technological intervention. So you can have smart cards that might store your data in a decentralized way on a microchip on the card, which will not open you up to all kinds of, creating a central honeypot, which can be attacked, where there can be data theft, etc. So there are technological solutions, but also more importantly, I think even a technological solution can only be implemented as well as the administrative machinery, right? So if you put good technology with bad administration and bureaucracy, you'll get something like Aadhaar, which is sort of big data meets big brother and goes Kafkaesque, right? You have the commercial interests, a marriage of convenience between the private sector and the government to the detriment of citizens' interests, in the way that they get caught up in all kinds of unnecessary paperwork and digital bureaucracy, red tapeism, etc.
So one of the things that we always keep saying in information systems is that the systems are only as good as the institutions which lie behind.
Right.
But we also have the idea through our theories and academic studies that technology also has agency. So it's a bit of a provocative question that do we think that technology can actually lead to a situation eventually that it's not just a case of collecting for the sake of collecting, but actually improving the situation in the long run. In terms of sort of enabling people to have more of an ownership of their own data.
I can share a positive note here. Very often, I believe very often when we speak about this topic, we end up in very sad arguments. And I say that as someone that does research on this topic. Very briefly, perhaps a little contribution from my work. Shirin, you mentioned my recent book, Unfair ID, for the Data Justice series of SAGE. And it's a book that tries to develop a data justice framework to digital identity. So we see data justice as justice in the way we visualize, represent, and treat people through their data. And I believe the short answer to your question is I don't see a reason why a fair ID would not, in principle, be possible. However, I also believe, as someone that researches this topic, that a fair ID requires scientifically engaging the harmful outcomes of digital identity systems. Edgar's report with the cost analysis, but also with the scenario that the report prospects has been an early example of this topic. I would say, as researchers of digital identity, today we have more evidence of such outcomes. I'll mention one out of many. So one report from the Center of Human Rights and Global Justice of New York University, 2022, scientifically engaging the connection between the implementation of certain centralized digital identity schemes and different forms of human rights harm. So is building a fair ID in principle impossible? I think not. Is, however, this, rephrase, I only see this possible based on a scientific identification of how harmful outcomes are produced. And again, the LSE Identity Report was a stellar early example of how this can be done. So,
yeah, good.
Like the opening lines of the LSE report was, we think identity systems can be helpful to people, just not this one. And ultimately, after like 25 years, I think for almost 30 years being in this country, I feel like things could work better if you just kept the Home Office away from it. But no system would ever be built to identify people unless the Home Office was driving it. So that's why this is always going to run into this problem. If the government genuinely wanted to create an infrastructure for identity that genuinely helped people, they wouldn't let the Home Office within 100 miles from it. And then it would happen. It couldn't really happen. There are smart people in this country, there's relatively decent infrastructure. Industry is interested in doing this right, but the Home Office keeps on getting it. And just to use an example of how it applies to other sectors, the Home Office, the government has a power in its surveillance law to issue secret orders against companies anywhere in the world to do something to their technology to undermine security. And they did that to Apple just a few months ago. They issued a secret order to Apple that essentially demanded that Apple undermine the security of every device that, every system that's running on their device anywhere around the world. That's the Home Office in action. So imagine an ID infrastructure was built that had empowered people, that had to be built by a company. There would be a secret order from the Home Office to undermine it. It's ridiculous, but that's what we keep on running into.
And I think there's a really interesting, so Phil Booth, who ran No to ID, had a really nice way of putting it. You should, if you see the ID system as being the enabler of confirmation that you're a citizen or that you have access to voting rights or whatever it might be, that system should be so boring that the security services would not be interested in it. Because if they want to know who is accessing welfare benefits, you can go to the welfare department. You shouldn't be, the ID system should just be enabling those transactions, but be of no interest to anybody. So there is a way of designing these systems, but whether it's a bright, shiny thing, whether it's I want to be the minister who has introduced this or that or whatever, and it's typically, it feels like 1970s Star Trek with shiny lights and wearing tapes and whatever. There does seem to be this vision that we just need to do something rather than we can actually take advantage of both the advanced technologies and the ways in which the UK is actually using those technologies to do progressive things.
So what I hear is, in a way, more inclusion, more engagement with civil society networks is something that Gus, you're heavily involved in. So are we saying that digital identity systems per se are not bad, but the way in which they are, the design, for example, the design aspect of it has got to be fully done with the engagement of civil society, however we want to define that?
Well, I think civil society would be the community that says you want an ID system that's inclusive, that includes everybody within it. And then they would say that, and we come from the migrant sector, we want them to be included in it. We come from a sector of other targeted communities. They should be invited into the system as well. That is the ID system that we should all dream of. One where nobody's afraid to be a part of it, and nobody wants to be outside of it. And that's what civil society would argue for. What government would argue for is a system that identifies the good and the bad, the ones we want to target. That's why, that's the fundamental difference.
And certainly as an academic, there is always that I've got my views, I've done my research, I've got the evidence, but I'm always suspicious that there could be other more compelling evidence arguments out there. And I'm always open to that alternative. So a phrase that I've always been impressed by is a good academic squirms. So you present this alternative evidence, and I'm squirming. Now I can continue the public debate and I can get through to that's a very good question. Could you send me the references at the end of the talk, etc., etc. But a good academic reflects on that and goes, maybe next time I need to be a little bit more careful. I need to think not just about migrants, but I need to think about people with physical disabilities, because they also will often be excluded, not because you are deliberately targeting and saying, oh, you've got, I don't know, facial disfigurements, so you can't do a biometric selfie, and we're designing our system to do that. It's just you never thought about that other community because it wasn't part of your development team or whatever. And it's that openness to skepticism and openness to other ideas that I think is certainly something that academics naturally do, and one would hope that governments can do as well.
So I just want to pick up on that. And going back to some of what you said, I think based on the Indian case and what we've seen over the past 15 years, it's very hard to think of a good ID, a fair ID, you know. So all the evidence so far has piled up the wrong way, right? And as far as digital, it's not about not having any IDs at all, or not having any digital IDs at all. Digital technologies have helped improve implementation of welfare programs. We have documented it. But when we bring that evidence to the table, somehow they turn a deaf ear to us, right? So then you begin to suspect what else is going on, that this kind of rational way of presenting relatively good evidence is completely being ignored, which makes at least me right now quite suspicious. So in the initial years, we were hedging a little bit because we thought, oh, one day they're going to find a good use for Aadhaar. And so we were always a little bit careful. But 15 years down the line, things, at least for poor people, have gotten pretty complicated. If they fall off the grid, if there's anything irregular about them, then they're really going to experience trouble. And just one very particular example, which is quite recent and which is a very peculiarly Indian thing, there are acid victims, they are attacked, somebody throws acid, mainly on women. And so that disfigures their faces in a way that is not readable to these biometric machines, right? And they have to go to the Supreme Court to get an order that would allow them to enroll and be authenticated, etc. So the burden that is being put on people, on ordinary people, for a not very well-defined gain, makes the whole project quite questionable in a context like India, I should add.
Yeah, I mean, we often associate information, digitization with this big word of democracy. And I often think to myself that, what does this mean? Is it just to do with, the state having the possibility to see and therefore to provide security and welfare and all the responsibilities that the state has in a democratic society? Or is it to do with using digital identification, identity credentials to enable debate and deliberation, which is a very important aspect of democracy? And if so, then can creating a database alone, without having the social spaces to make that more fluid? These are not just discrete categories. We're talking about human beings which have social affiliations, etc. Any thoughts on that, panelists?
Yep, I just want to go back, and it reminded me of a wonderful statement from Neil Postman in his book Technopoly about the views on technology. And he said, in earlier times, we used to say it is God's will. Now we say the computer says no. And so there is that sense that the computer has become the God, but that isn't actually answering your question. So I'll leave that for somebody else to.
So I don't directly work on the implications of ID for democracy, but I might be able to add here, because one thing that we work a lot on at least in the study of welfare system is entitlements. So it's very much a matter of the extent to which biometric systems can mediate access to entitlements. And there is an expression that we use quite a lot in the information systems domain, and that's the dark side of technology. So, for example, we speak about the dark side when a glitch happens and a system that normally works for good ends up not delivering the expected outcomes. In our case, in the systems that we study, for example, when the person is denied their entitlements. I work on food security, so that's mainly, again, food, rice, wheat, commodities. So denial of very essential entitlements. And I wonder, perhaps one contribution here can be, to what extent is that aside in a technology that is designed to include all those entitled, but does really little in its design to actually enable inclusion of those that for any reason computer says no, are not included. So perhaps another contribution here is very much the idea of design justice. There is a splendid book I want to cite here by Sasha Costanza Schock, and that's exactly Design Justice from 2020. And it's a book that tries to see, another positive note here, tries to see how beyond dark sides, how injustice designed into technology can be countered in order to, again, I'm repeating the point from before, but to scientifically understand how injustice is produced and then build just outcomes into technology. Positive note for us.
Great. So let's have one more question, I think, before we open it up to the floor and to questions online, which is the momentum towards digital public infrastructure. And we do know that the identity layer is just one layer, which is going to connect to the payments infrastructures that we have, data exchange. We have this coming up in all countries, in the UK, in Europe, in the African Union, as well, of course, as in India. Is this something that we should be extremely worried about, in the sense that we have all these issues that we've talked about just with digital identity systems, but now we have digital identity systems which are fully ingrained into public infrastructures, which means that it's hard to even unravel and sort out just the digital identity system. And these sorts of infrastructures are being showcased and they are being transferred to different parts of the world.
So digital public infrastructures, DPIs, at one level are just the latest catchy phrase. They're a little bit more than just an ID system. You throw in the word stack because they're all going to be interconnected. You probably say Estonia, you probably say Aadhaar. And so there is a certain momentum, and you can understand why, if you want to be doing things, you use the language that the donors will support and the donors will fund. There's also a really interesting question that if you are so reliant on donor funding, what happens when the donor funding comes to an end? Because you would hope that this brilliant system that everybody agrees is the right way to go about doing it, once the money from the donors ends, it is able to prove its worth. It's going to be self-funding, self-reliant. Everyone's happy to pay a bit more on their taxes to keep these systems running. And technically, we're at the stage where none of these systems have been around long enough to know whether they are actually self-sufficient when the donor funding comes to an end. Some of the people I've been speaking to are very skeptical about, well, if you've got essentially free money, then you don't have to make the tough business decisions about what do we do to anticipate in 2 years' time when that funding comes to an end. We've got all of these different bits that are supposed to integrate smoothly, but who updates, who manages, how do we deal with security breaches? I mean, when big companies in the UK like Marks and Spencer's suddenly have huge outages, when the British Library gets cyber attacked and is offline for months and months and months, what happens if your brilliant digital public infrastructure needs an upgrade and you don't have the capabilities in country and you don't have the funds to hire external consultants to help you continue your technology transfer, which has always gone brilliantly. Sorry, it's slightly sarcastic. It's always done brilliantly in the past as a way of continuing these systems from going on.
Yeah, Ritika?
So in the Indian context, again, that's the only one that I'm familiar with. I thought maybe I'll give a couple of concrete examples which can explain the anxieties that I have about these things. So there are loan apps now, right? You can download an app on your phone and you can get an instant loan based on putting some numbers in. And suddenly they found there was a bunch of suicides in one state, and they were traced to loans that people had taken through these loan apps. Turns out they were shady operators. And one particular instance where the person was caught, and about a year or two later, the Reserve Bank of India, the central bank in India, caught up and got those apps taken down. But meanwhile, a few people had lost their lives. In one particular case, what we learned is that when you download these apps, it asks for access to a whole bunch of hardware and stuff on your own, so your contacts, your photographs, etc. So some people had used that app to get a loan. There were hidden terms and conditions. They were unaware of it. So this tells you a lot about the state of digital literacy in the country, right? Even I might not pay attention. And if I'm not a literate person, then, how much can I deal with all these things? So they got a loan, then they started being hounded by the company to repay, and they were not able to do it. And what the people did, the persons who were running the app, they used the photographs that were on that person's phone, morphed them, and started blackmailing them that we're going to send this morphed photograph in a compromising position, etc., to all your contacts. Right? So this is the kind of worry that one has when these kinds of data, where there is no proper protection, which is not implemented, where the boundaries of what is being shared and to whom and for what purpose, etc. Especially in a context where we don't even have universal literacy, forget digital literacy. So I feel that one has to proceed quite carefully, and the context matters quite a lot. Maybe in a country like the UK, it might work. But I think in an Indian context, the consequences are that the rich will have a smooth ride. Like during COVID, children of privileged families were able to transition very easily to online classes. But a very large chunk, they didn't have a mobile phone in the house, they didn't have money to buy data, they didn't have connectivity, etc. And what happens is that it's only the reality of the top 30-40%, which is talked about in the media. So everyone thinks, hey, everything's going well, so why are you grumbling about these things?
But also the very systemic nature of what we're talking about, whether we're talking about an advanced industrialized country like the UK, I don't think it's going to be possible to diagnose and find out exactly where the breach is occurring.
I just don't understand it. Like security is so hard to do. It's practically impossible. Like the Snowden disclosures in 2013 showed that one thing the UK is very good at is hacking the databases of other countries. And so they were hacking the ID databases, downloading that data and having a local copy. Every government worth its salt that can do computer security, more often than not, they're doing exactly the same thing. But they're also, there's a certain benefit too, like in the months before Russia invaded Ukraine, even as the French government was saying it's not going to happen, it's not going to happen, the British and the Americans parachuted into Ukraine and started patching the computer systems because they knew that they were all vulnerable, and that's what Russia was going to target first. And that's why Russia struggled so much in the war, because the rail infrastructure was secured at the last minute. The electricity infrastructure was secured at the last minute. This is what it means today to be secure. And to build an infrastructure without security first that citizens are dependent upon in an environment where we're remilitarizing as a world, that's negligent.
Yeah, it really is. I think this is a time when we should open up to questions. First, we will turn to questions from the audience here. Yes, we have a question here. You can either direct it to any particular panelist or keep it general, and then one will answer.
Yeah. So in the 20 years since the identity report came out, I think some of those ideas for what a better system could look like have kind of taken root, both here but also in other countries in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, all the Five Eyes. And at least in those countries and maybe Europe, do you think we're kind of getting close to what a good identity system could be? Or maybe to be provocative, is that a contradiction in terms?
So just to repeat for the online, there are examples of ID systems that have kind of been inspired by some of the thinking that we drew on for this report. And the question is, are we getting too close to a good ID that we can then run out? Closer is just, I'm an academic, closer rather than close. I mean, there are things that, just some very, very simple things that we now know are just silly things to do. So having what they used to call a smart ID number that would record your date of birth and probably a code for your location where you were born kind of makes a lot of sense, because you can then work out from the number how old someone is. We can add gender, that gets a bit complicated, but it doesn't work in an environment where lots of the people in your country are not nationals of your country, because then you have to give everybody the code for born in the rest of the world. And then you suddenly get to, there were lots of people born on April the 1st, 2005 in the rest of the world, and your smart number system falls down. So there are some lessons that just about nobody is repeating. But beyond that, there are good practices that people go, yeah, that kind of makes a lot of sense. Let's consult with civil society. Let's try to be a bit more inclusive. But whether everybody has the time, the energy, the mental space to do that, I'm still a little bit, well, I hope that there's still lots for me to keep researching, is the other way of looking at it.
More questions?
Is there a world in which disentangle ourselves from certain forms of identification? So I'm curious, specifically in the case of Aadhaar, is there a world in which we can undo the harmless or undo the ID itself? How do we get there? I think that's possible. I know it's not like a little further than data activism, but is there a way we go back or reset the slate?
So perhaps I can take this one. So yes, the question is there a world in which we can disentangle ourselves from ID forms? I guess my approach to that question is, I'm an academic too, so essentially, how would things be if they were in a way back to the physical world? I believe, as someone that researches ICTs in developing contexts, we have multiple examples of physical systems converted digital. There is, for example, plenty of work on humanitarian programs like work for cash programs that converted from the physical to the digital. And I'll cite again the report from New York University saying, in many cases, in transitioning to the biometric system, we lose important information, for example, very material, cash envelope, so information and material that is relevant to the person. And it's information that we may lose with the biometric transition. So is there a way to disentangle ourselves? Difficult for me personally as someone that researches these things to imagine this scenario, but important to imagine how things in the physical world can convey benefits that we may lose, that research shows we may lose with the biometric transition.
So in the Indian case, I think the only hope is that it will be crushed under its own weight, because everything is becoming so complicated for everyone that eventually they may be forced to make it voluntary again, in which case a lot of the problems that ordinary people face are likely to be resolved. Because the minute you make it voluntary to access your school admission or your rations or employment or salaries or pensions, then it becomes inconsequential and the pain goes away.
Thank you.
I think war is going to have a role to play in this. I think when you look at, I don't want to get into controversial areas, but when we talk about automation of war, and the value of data for targeting. I think at some point you're going to see a recognition that the accumulation of data becomes a national security risk. And we have to stop accumulating that data. If we can design drones that can target people based on their face because their face was in a database that got hacked somewhere, maybe we shouldn't be storing more faces in databases. I think that is falling under its own weight in the world that we have today.
Do we think that this kind of decision, at that decision, critical decision point, would it be taken by states, by government, or would it be a revolution that people just cannot stand? No, I mean, I'm just asking that.
Well, I would like the humanitarian sector to start recognizing that now based on the technologies we've seen in the last couple of years, because the humanitarian sector is the most biometric obsessed sector for reasons it's like we've been warning them about for 15 years, but they just thought fighting fraud was more important than protecting their beneficiaries. I can tell you that the government that you can trust to be most concerned about the security of their data is the Israeli government. And they have had their database hacked repeatedly, and it is a highly political concern for them because they recognize it's a national security risk. So we would hope that the next steps that follow will be a little bit more positive. But if we're looking at what's happening in humanitarian settings, the closer they are to war, unfortunately, we're still accumulating vast amounts of data.
Questions online? Questions?
This one.
People in the audience? Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you, and thank you for the panelists. Just very interesting, very stimulating discussion. My question for the panelists is that since UK is going to launch another identity card system, is planning to launch one, is the LSE going to, has it started to do the groundwork and is it planning to respond again, or is it just exhausted and tired and doesn't really want to or doesn't really care anymore? I'm just curious, what will be the next steps? I mean, is there any preparation being done?
So at the moment,
You need to repeat the
yeah.
question.
So the question is that there are these proposals, the BRIC card. Is LSE going to step in and et cetera, et cetera? At the moment, this is a policy document from a think tank that has very close connections to the government. We've been engaging with them, raising a whole series of very practical concerns with the proposals. I gave them this feedback and they ignored it, so I'll repeat it for the podcast. Calling it a BRIC card is going to not go down very well with the Catholic community in Northern Ireland as a result of the Good Friday Agreement, because they see themselves, many of them will see themselves as Irish and not British. The report talks about having the Union flag on the BRIC card. That's also not going to fly very, very well. So let's say that the policy is likely to evolve, and let's hope that if it does become something more serious, they have a read of this and all the other research that's been done in the last 20 years. Whether we will lead that, yeah, we'll wait and see for it before it becomes a serious threat, before we actively commit to another 5 years of effort.
But the UK, in a way, is avoided and successfully avoided having a centralized system. Do you think that there are dangers that might also?
I mean, I think that's one where the change in the technology and the fact that, so everybody's heard about Bitcoin, everyone knows that decentralized architectures can do lots of interesting things, maybe in ways that actually you don't really want Bitcoin because that's all sorts of money laundering problems. But the idea that you now have decentralized architectures that give you a realistic, understood, viable alternative to, well, surely the only way you can do this is by having a single database and give everybody a single number. There is a bit more sophistication, so that when we say there are different ways of doing it, that will hopefully be slightly more widely understood as well as better received.
And if I could respond by saying, I'm not tired of ID. I'm just a little exasperated with informing policy debate in this country. The political system is really hard to inform. Like when we talk about a report that was written in 2005, the engagement we did was from 2004 to 2010, at least, if not longer. That Edgar continued for years after that. And so you have to give so much energy to then just be dismissed as technically incompetent. It just, what is the reward for trying when we're dealing with complicated technical systems? I don't know. And is the political discourse in this country better than it was in 2005, or is it poorer? And I don't know if that's the question of energy as much as it is, like Edgar's going to do the analysis for sure, but will it have the currency that was possible back then?
More questions?
Yeah.
So the question, I don't know if you studied public opinions on those different initiatives. UK is fairly unique in not having ID systems, but it doesn't mean that even in UK everyone thinks the same. So I wonder if we can comment on that.
So the question was around public opinion, and let's just put it this way. When you're introducing a policy that necessarily affects the whole population, could be ID cards, could be anything else. In my experience, and when it came to the ID system back in 2002 to 2005, the public support's 80% in favor of the introduction of a system. Because at that point, it's being justified for this, and that. So how could you not be part of that 80%? There'll always be the 20% who hate anything that gets introduced. That's a reality. And again, for a mandatory system where there's that 20% in every society on the planet, that's where inclusion becomes a particular challenge. What we were successful in doing between, say, the months of January to June 2005 was that the polling dramatically changed. And so there was a poll done early July 2005 that found that support for the ID card that had been high at 80 for a number of years had dropped to 45% once people started to understand the different ways it would integrate into their lives, including the cost. Now, there's something about that date, though. 4 days later, bombs started blowing up on the tube and on buses in London. And we were very concerned that this would just set everything back. People would just run towards national security and say, oh, we want our ID cards. What was interesting is that polling done after that date, directly after that date, while we were still wounded from it all, public support had gone up, but to 50% only. At some point, once the public starts having to grasp with the complexities of something, nuance sets in. 80% is impossible.
And of course, you also have the methodological concern that is best demonstrated from, it's either yes minister or yes prime minister, where how you word the question you can ask a question. We don't like, I know, people with black shoes. Would you support a proposal that would reduce the wearing of black shoes in modern society? Yes, of course. I mean, you can always, would you mind if it was also going to mean that every time you went out of the house, somebody checked what shoes you were doing? Hang on a second, that's getting a little, so you can always phrase questions to get headline grabbing levels of support. It's the next level of detail. How is it going to work? How is it going to impact? How long do you have to queue to do that if you don't have the documents? When during the pandemic, when you had to get your NHS COVID pass, if you didn't already have an NHS app, having to prove who you were could be incredibly complicated. I remember my brother was visiting my mum and she had to have the video with the selfie reading out the text just to confirm that she was this woman in her late 70s, early 80s, so that she could have a COVID pass, so she could go. When you start saying this is what it's actually going to involve, people suddenly go, hang on a second, maybe I'm not quite so supportive of these kinds of things. So I think there's a really big question around what exactly is the question. And part of that is also how much have you understood about what's actually going to be involved in that kind of process? Is there a question behind? Okay.
Yeah, so we've got I'll do two questions from the online, as well as one comment from Ian Angel,
Okay.
Emeritus Professor in the
Yeah.
Parliament. He says, I had the honour of being at LSE for this report. For my 30 years at LSE, I would tell my students that there are no solutions, only contingencies. Systems have one thing in common, they all fail. All solution are the instantiation of linear thinking into a non-linear world. Ambiguity is built into every solution.
That's so Ian. Thank you so much.
My PhD supervisor.
And the questions, could you share your thoughts on governments who might use digital ID systems to target certain groups for discrimination based on verification criteria? And what challenges do countries face when introducing identity systems to meet Sustainable Development Goal 16.9?
So I can perhaps, so the second question was about addressing Sustainable Development Goal 16.9. The logic there is, and it's a classic compromise, the underlying spirit is everybody should have a legal identity, some way of proving who they are to the state so that you can have a right to vote, be able to open a bank account, inherit property, etc., etc. So that's the intention. And then there was a bit of a diplomatic compromise, including birth registration. And universal birth registration from the civil registration and vital statistics perspective is a key enabler because lots of ID systems historically have drawn on birth records. We know that you were born, questions about citizenship, you were born, then we can use that to feed into the records that we can then use to prove that you are doing it. Then you have examples like Aadhaar that kind of says we don't need to do the birth registration side because we've got other ways of proving who you are because you're just in the database once because we've used the biometrics to not do it. So there's a bit of a tension there. There's a further complication that is a pandemic specific one, which is how many births were registered in hospitals during the pandemic because lots of people would have home births. And then when you are catching up with all of those like registrations, you have real practical problems because if you were not in the system at the beginning, proving that you are the person who's now 5 years old or that the child is now 5 years old becomes much more complicated. In some countries, you literally have to go to court with 3 members of your local community who will vouch that, sorry, we didn't do the formal registration at the time. So there's a whole complication around that. The spirit is there. I quite like the idea of having a goal because then countries go, oh my goodness, we're quite low on this. We should perhaps spend some more emphasis on addressing, and it's 16.9 because there's a whole load of sustainable development goals and a whole set of sub-sustainable development goals. But that idea of a metric that you can potentially be embarrassed at because your score, your coverage is not as good as other countries does broadly have an incentive effect. And I forgot the first question, so I'll let someone else.
Discrimination.
Someone else can answer that.
But I can have a go at that one. So the question was, yeah, in terms of like the discrimination affordances of digital identity systems, I'd like to introduce again a design justice perspective here. So in the moment in which we see what a technology can produce, so well, in technologies like those we study, like biometric systems of access to essential welfare programs. Well, the technology can, like Tika said before, like we made the example before, essentially deny a certain group, a certain particular community access to very essential needs. So I believe a design justice perspective, so a perspective that looks at what design can produce in terms of direct effect on entitlements can really help us making sense of discrimination and making sense of the surveillance affordances that the technologies we study look at. Ritika has a splendid book called Descent on Aadhaar, Big Brother
Meets big data.
meets
It's the other way around.
big data meets big brother, and I think the point you make in the book is exactly this. So how surveillance affordances can be produced through technologies, through the so-called pro-development technologies. So
So very quickly on just using Aadhaar as an example again, I think the people who designed it were used to Indians or Indian residents who would be named with a first name and a second name, right? And actually in some parts of the country, they don't use a second name. In other places, where there are tribal communities, they have other ways of naming conventions, right? And so even maybe perhaps without meaning to discriminate, they end up discriminating. Another community that is facing, I think, just with the name, yeah, the first demographic information are Muslims, because they again have different naming conventions than the ones that the people who designed these systems were used to. So inadvertently, they end up discriminating against certain, they may end up, and then of course, if they want to use it badly, it's very easy.
And I think the other side, so another side to discrimination is we just don't give you a card. And that can be particular communities in different parts of the world. You just say, we don't recognize you. That then ties in with questions of citizenship. And Bronwyn Mundy, a good colleague of ours, is really good on all of the complexities of citizenship laws across Africa, where they're often just your parents were from this country, you were born in that country, and there's just no category for you in that kind of a thing. But it also comes back to, what is the purpose of the card? Is the purpose of the card to prove that you are a citizen? And Aadhaar was quite clever by saying it's residents rather than citizens, because we don't want to have to prove citizenship. But if you are going, and if you want it to be a better way of operating in a society, you don't want it just for your citizens. You want it for anybody who is legitimately in the country. So you want it to be less discriminatory for anybody who can satisfy the rules to get in, but then be able to use it for whatever purposes you have in your society.
Like you said, because everything I hear about digital identity is about discrimination, immigration. How can we create the awareness for people to know the usefulness of digital ID card instead of having that sort of immigration and using it to discriminate?
So the positive use cases, absolutely. I mean, that's why we are trying to make better IDs, trying to inform for better IDs, because it's never a question of whether, the way I like to phrase it, it's always a question of how. So it's about, if you want to do it in these positive ways, how can we design the system so that concerns about exclusion, concerns about technological security failures, whatever, are minimized as far as possible? Because the ability, so we did some research where it was a funding body, and they were supporting lots of good initiatives, like encouraging financial inclusion, allowing people to inherit properties from their family, addressing young girls being married at too young an age, addressing modern slavery and those kinds of things. And they kept saying, well, we want to do all of these good things, but we keep coming back to the need to know that you are a person, that we know of you. If you've got somebody's date of birth registered, then you can say, you are 14, we cannot allow you to get married. If you know that you are the child of the parents and the parents have some land, then it's a lot easier to inherit those kinds of things. So there are lots of positive benefits for having some form of ID that is recognized, appreciated, usable. But the question for us is, how do we get to that good space without falling for many of the kinds of problems that we have perhaps been a little bit more pessimistic in describing?
Thank you so much. So my question was, you made some really nice points. You touched upon DPI in the last question, and you're right in saying that there are definitely some concerns, and at the same time, you just touched upon some of the positives of digital identity. So when we see, DPI implementation in states that don't have, large state capacity, we need identity to streamline benefits. and other aspects of service delivery, we still need that sort of consultation with civil society on the privacy related aspects of this, the design aspects of this. Can you touch on what your experience has been of maybe engaging with that ecosystem? Do you think that ecosystem engages enough with these security aspects of things? It's very critical. This is going into very vulnerable geographies. And if you don't, then what gaps do you think you need to fill?
Gus, on security again?
I just never see it being prioritized, but I don't work on DPI, so I can't comment on that, unfortunately.
The question of state capacity is a really interesting one, and again, one that certainly some of the development banks explicitly address. So if you are procuring an ID system, particularly pre-DPI, when it would be only available from commercial providers, you have a couple of civil servants in a country with limited knowledge about those kinds of things. So a number of the development banks would literally, as part of their grant or part of their loan, include a line item to hire a consultant who will give, and that could be a security consultant, who can give you a more informed buyer's position against the hard sell from the ID providers, and in the same way can also help you ask the tough questions of your digital public infrastructure, open source alternative kind of thing. So many countries don't have that state capacity. So the question is, how can you provide it? And certainly giving money to and earmarking the money and saying you must hire some consultants who will advise you. Now, of course, you then run the problem of it's the same consultant, blah, blah, blah. But at least you are trying to at least level out the levels of knowledge between the country that just wants to do it and has no idea how, and the people who say, well, we've got this product, we'll sell it to you because it sort of fits, or we need to, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, let us thank our panelists and thank you all very much for coming and for your questions.